From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome. I'm Stephen Winnick. I'm the writer and editor at the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress. And on behalf of the entire center staff, I would like to welcome you to a special presentation in our Benjamin Botkin Folklife Lecture Series. The Botkin series provides a platform for professional folklorists and ethnographers working both in the academy and in the public sector to present findings of their ongoing research. And it allows us to interact with the cutting-edge scholars in folklife and cultural heritage today, while also building the collections here at the library. These lectures are an important acquisitions project for the center. They're being videotaped and they become part of our collections. And they also are developed into webcasts for the Library of Congress website. So many of these are then viewable by the public for many years. In this way, the Botkin Lecture Series helps the American Folklife Center fulfill its mandate to preserve and present the folklife scholarship that is informing our world today. So today I have the distinct honor of introducing Professor Wolfgang Mieder, Professor of German and Folklore at the University of Vermont, where he chaired the Department of German and Russian for over 30 years. Professor Mieder is the winner of many awards for his teaching and research, and suffice it to say that he's one of the foremost folklorists in the world. The folklore world loves Wolfgang so much that no fewer than 4 Festschrifts have been published for him, one of which I am proud to have co-edited myself. And Professor Mieder has written about fairy tales and legends, about folk songs, and of course about German literature, but he is best known as a scholar of Proverbs, one of our smallest and most common traditional spoken genres. When I talk about my own work on Proverbs, I refer to Wolfgang by using a proverbial phrase that goes back to at least the 12th century, you'll be happy to know, Wolfgang, in both Christian and Jewish hermeneutics. I say that I am only a little person standing on the shoulders of a giant, which becomes a better joke if you see Wolfgang and me standing side by side. For about 15 years now, one of Wolfgang's major areas of focus has been how political orators have used Proverbs to affect political and social change. And among his writings on this topic, he's explored the use of Proverbs by Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Barack Obama, among many others. And he has information about his books and literature on that outside, and you can see that as you go out. Today, he's going to speak to us about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the subject of one of his latest books. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wolfgang Mieder.
Look at this, the giant and the dwarf. Well, thank you very much, Steve, for your wonderful and kind introduction. These type of introductions always. Yeah. Maybe I could stand on a chair, that would help. But it's always embarrassing to have your, song sung by, but since Steve is a wonderful friend, and I had the honor and privilege to be on Steve's dissertation topic, so I'll return the favor and declare herewith that Steve is one of the brightest young folklorists in the United States, and very soon to overtake his mentor if he hasn't done already so. Anyhow, I'm really delighted to come here, and I want to start with an apology that if you came, when was it, January 13th, when the original talk was scheduled, but there was just no way for me to get out of snowbound Vermont, but I think that was the same day that New York was completely snowed in and you were, so I apologize to you for that. But I want to thank Steve, of course, but also Peggy Bulger as the director of the American Folklife Center, and her colleagues Nancy Gross and Thea Austin and Michael Taft, and Steve, of course, for inviting me to come here to the Library of Congress and to talk about Martin Luther King. It's an incredible honor. I looked at the list of former Botkin lecturers, and so I really appreciate the honor to be able to speak to you in the series of the Botkin lectures. Benjamin Botkin was of great influence, not just to many, many American folklorists, but also to me personally. I did not go to a wonderful PhD folklore program as Steve did at the University of Pennsylvania, but I kind of came in through the back door as a literary person. But I still remember very early coming across Botkin's books like A Treasury of American Folklore and A Treasury of New England Folklore, but above all, his book that lay my burden down, A Folk History of Slavery, I think was a book that influenced me greatly and in many ways was influential in my getting interested some 10, 11 years ago in working on Frederick Douglass first, and then on Abraham Lincoln and some others that Steve mentioned. I wanted to also make a small personal statement. I immigrated to the United States by myself at the age of 16, some exactly 50 years ago, and it has been a tremendous experience for me. I arrived in 1960 and had the privilege to wind up in a truly liberal family in Detroit. And so I kind of experienced the civil rights movement as a very innocent, naive German immigrant boy, and was, of course, touched by it during the time. And this led me, I think, in a kind of a natural way to work later on in my life on someone like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, and also on Obama. I'm a little bit of a slow learner. It took me 40 years to decide to become an American citizen, but I did do it 10 years ago. And I remember that was a very, very emotional moment for me. And I also recall that in my book on Frederick Douglass, I said that I remember I used to sit there and read the works of Douglass and just almost shuddered in amazement how man like Douglass could, without ever having gone to school, reach such an incredible linguistic prowess, emotional strength to write and speak the way he did. And one night, as I was sitting there in snowbound Vermont, I decided, with such admiration for someone like Frederick Douglass, I think I ought to make that step and become an American. And so it's always been a very emotional matter for me. And of course, I never would have dreamt that one day, 50 years later, a little immigrant boy would stand here at the Library of Congress and having the honor to speak about another one of my heroes, and your hero, of course, too, and that is Martin Luther King. So I'm very humbled and honored to be here. And before I start, these lectures always have wonderful moments. A moment ago, a former student of mine, Steve Folsom, he's sitting right over there. Steve, when have I seen you last time? 30 years ago? I recognized him immediately. But that poor man, listen to this, that poor man suffered with the Mieder family a total of 10 years. He had my beloved wife, Barbara, for 4 years at Milton High School for German. Then he came to the University of Vermont, was foolish enough to major in German with me for 4 years. Then the fool went on to an MA degree for 2 years. But of course, he's an extremely well-educated young man working here at the Library of Congress. So Steve, it's wonderful to see you, and I very fondly remember your parents as well. And I can hardly wait to tell my wife when I come home tonight whom I saw. Anyhow, we're here to listen to about Martin Luther King. As you know, I entitled my lecture, Making a Way Out of No Way, Martin Luther King's Use of Proverbs for Civil Rights. As we, all of us, I think, well aware of, a vast array of biographies and studies have celebrated Martin Luther King as a civil rights leader, a defender of nonviolence in the struggle for desegregation, a champion for the poor, an anti-war proponent, and a broad-minded visionary of an interrelated world of free people. The proverbial truth expressed in the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and that they have the right for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, form the basis of this engaged and heartfelt fight for freedom, universal suffrage, anti-racism, and socio-economic improvements for minorities. As a communicator par excellence, he made ample use of fixed phrases as leitmotifs in his effective oral and written rhetoric in the service of a plethora of topics and causes. Even though the term proverb does not belong to King's active vocabulary, he hardly ever uses the word proverb when he uses them. He most certainly delights in using folk and Bible proverbs, famous quotations, of which some, as we will see, have become proverbial, and a wealth of proverbial phrases. So even though King is not prone to use the term proverb, he certainly based a number of sermonic outlines and actual sermons on the explication of proverbs, citing them at times as leitmotifs, but not explicitly referring to them as Bible or folk proverbs. Always being the preacher and teacher, of course, it is not surprising that he would call on such proverbial wisdom as a base of his religious and social messages. An early example can be seen from a minuscule sermon in just an introduction, with the proverb, "Life is what you make it," as a title. So here's just a little introduction to a sermon. Life is what you make it. Many people wander into the world and they pick up everything they can get their hands upon looking for life. They never get it. What they get is existence. Existence is what you find. Life is what you create. Therefore, if life ever seems worthwhile to you, it is not because you found it that way, but because you made it that way. Always having yet another sermon in mind, King also wrote down short sermon conclusions that might come in handy when another text needed to be composed in a hurry. There were times when Martin Luther gave at least 2 talks a day. These introductions and conclusions were kept in folders for ready reference. The following example is once again of special interest, since King this time uses the introductory formula, "There is an old saying," to indicate that he is citing a folk proverb. And the little conclusion he entitled, "Success in Life." There is an old saying, "If wishes were horses, beggars would ride." Friends, the great high road of success lies along the old highway to steadfast well-doing, and they who are the most industrious and the most persistent and work in the truest spirit will invariably be the most successful. Success treads on the heels of every right effort. While such paragraphs are mere rudiments, of course, King also has left us with complete sermons, with a proverbial title and an ensuing explication of that very text. The quintessential example is King's preoccupation with the Bible proverb, "Love your enemies," Matthew 5:44. Which he explicated in a number of related so-called loving your enemies sermons. In fact, King used the proverb, "Love your enemies," a total of 53 times in the 6,000 pages of Martin Luther King that I read to stand here in front of you. And it will be no surprise to anyone that it is Martin Luther King's most favorite proverb as an expression of his religiously based fundamental concept of nonviolence. This all-pervasive proverb illustrates the many mutations of King's basic argument that love is the key element in a world of nonviolence. Adding the proverb, hate begets hate, as a warning to his emphasis on the Bible proverb, "Love your enemies," he makes the following strong statement in one of the restatements of his sermon in his book, Strength to Love, from 1963. And here's what he says: "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction." So when Jesus says, "Love your enemies," he is setting forth a profound and ultimately inescapable admonition. Have we not come to such an impasse in the modern world that we must love our enemies or else? The chain reaction of evil, he says, hate begetting hate, Wars producing more wars must be broken, or we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. This paragraph, I would argue, becomes a proverbial cautionary tale, as in fact many of King's sermons might well be classified. Of course, despite of all of this anxiety, gloom, and despair, King always has the audacity of hope for a better world. The purpose of this sermonic exculpation of Proverbs is thus an uplifting attempt of finding a better way for humankind to struggle for freedom and peace throughout the world. His favorite Bible proverb, "Love your enemies," is without doubt the wisdom that perhaps can lead us there. Martin Luther King was above all a preacher whose rhetoric was of the biblical vernacular. He knew his Bible, and he spoke and wrote with the Holy Book always on his mind. He could cite entire passages from the Bible as a preacher himself, and he used its well-known passages to add authority to his views and arguments. The scriptures were always with him, but he quoted them. He was perfectly capable to apply them to the socio-political issues of his time. A fine example involves the widely known Bible proverb, "Man does not live by bread alone," both in the Old and New Testament, Deuteronomy 8:3 and Matthew 4:4. King used it in a sermon on the Christian doctrine of man on March 12, 1958 in Detroit, stating that he as a minister has a moral and social obligation to his parishioners and the world at large. You hear me say the word world a lot. That's one of the things that as more I read about Martin Luther King, the older he got, as you know, ever more interested in world affairs, especially once he went to India and also received the Nobel Prize. So the world, his vision increased far beyond the United States as he went along. But there's also an extremely important interpretive twist of the proverb in this text when King states that the word alone, man does not live by bread alone, in the proverb implies that Jesus was very well aware that man cannot live without bread, nor by it alone. And this in turn gives King the proverbial argument that poverty must be combated in the United States and again throughout the world. Here's how he puts it. Jesus realized that men had to have certain physical necessities. One day he said, "Man cannot live by bread alone." But the mere fact that the alone was added means that Jesus realized that man could not live without bread. So as a minister of the gospel, I, Martin Luther King, must not only preach to men and women to be good, I must be concerned about the social conditions that make them bad. It's not enough for me to tell men to be honest, but I must be concerned about the economic conditions that make them dishonest. I must be concerned about the poverty in the world. I must be concerned about the ignorance in the world. I must be concerned about the slums in the world. Usually relying on the proverbial wisdom of Jesus, King found the perfect metaphor for his social agenda in the New Testament proverb, "He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword," Matthew 26:52. It became the symbolic argument against all the ills of violent mistreatment of others, with King citing the proverb in an address on June 27, 1956 at San Francisco as a metaphorical sign of violence that must be overcome by a philosophy of nonviolence. And again, he said, "From the beginning there has been a basic philosophy undergirding our movement," the civil rights movement. It is a philosophy of nonviolent resistance. It is a philosophy which simply says we will refuse on a nonviolent basis to cooperate with the evil of segregation. In our struggle in America, we cannot fret with the idea of retaliatory violence. To use the method of violence would be both impractical and immoral. There is the voice crying through the vista of time, saying, "He who lives by the sword shall perish by the sword." History is replete with the bleached bones of nations who failed to hear these words of truth. And so we decided to use the method of nonviolence, feeling that violence would not do the job. While Martin Luther King has numerous favorite Bible proverbs, as you can imagine, and literary quotations that he cites on numerous occasions as rhetorical leitmotifs, he does not show this great fascination with any particular folk proverb. Yet, just as Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass have done before him, and as President Barack Obama is doing now, it is the combined emphasis on Bible and folk proverbs that makes their socio-political statements so effective. People then and now could easily identify with the wisdom and subsequently marched along with their champions in the struggle for equality and freedom. There is no doubt that proverbs have played a significant role in political discourse over the centuries, and they continue to be of considerable effectiveness in national and international politics today. Now, King certainly utilizes various proverbs and proverbial expressions in his depictions of segregation and the necessary fight against it. There is, in fact, a most fitting proverb that King found to describe how African Americans have fought segregation in a nonviolent way by, proverbially speaking, straightening up their backs and thereby validating the proverb, "You can't ride a man's back unless it is bent." The passage that includes the proverbial phrase and the proverb in tandem appears in the published version of an interview in the January 1965 issue of Playboy, no less. It's a very good interview, by the way. I remember we used to use that as an argument to read Playboy when I was younger. damn good interviews. But I don't know how many of them I read, but anyway. This is the moment of truth. I don't even think that I read the darn interview with Martin Luther King in 1965, and I was a college kid at the time. But anyhow, time passes and you get wiser. But anyhow, here's what he said: the Negro people in Georgia straightened up their bent backs. To straighten up your bent back would be the proverbial phrase. And then comes the proverb, "You can't ride a man's back unless it is bent." Also, thousands of Negroes registered to vote who never had voted before. And because of the expanded Negro vote in the next election for governor of Georgia, which pitted a moderate candidate against a rabid segregationist, Georgia elected its first governor who had pledged to respect and enforce the law impartially. We have never since scattered our efforts in a general attack on segregation, but have focused upon specific symbolic objectives. Martin Luther King saw one of his major breakthroughs in this, not to go so much all at once general, but to, let's just say, go to Salem and fight there, go to another place, and so on. In his stirring address of June 23, 1963, at the Freedom Rally in Cobo Hall at Detroit, King cites the modern proverb, "last hired, first fired," as an unfortunate truism, especially regarding the employment injustice that African Americans face in light of racial discrimination, saying, "We've been pushed around so long. We've been the victims of lynching mobs so long. We've been the victims of economic injustice so long. Still the last hired and the first fired all over this nation. And I know the temptation. I can understand from a psychological point of view why some caught up in the clutches of the injustices surrounding them almost respond with bitterness and come to the conclusion that the problem can't be solved. But I believe that this nonviolent philosophy and this determined struggle, we will be able to go on in the days ahead and transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood." The element of time in eradicating such racial injustice wore heavily on Martin Luther King's mind. In his chapter on the dilemma of Negro Americans in his book, Where Do We Go From Now? Chaos or Community, in 1967, he alludes to the two folk proverbs, "Time heals all wounds," and "Time and tide wait for no man," with the first alteration implying that the evils of segregation will not be forgotten, and that the second variation stating that the time has surely come to rid the country of this racial injustice once and for all. And he said, structures of evil do not crumble by passive waiting. If history teaches anything, it is that evil is recalcitrant and determined, and never voluntarily relinquishes its hold short of an almost fanatical resistance. We must get rid of the false notion that there is some miraculous quality in the flow of time that inevitably heals all evils. You can see where the proverb is hidden. Time heals all wounds. Nicely done. We must get rid of the false notion that there is some miraculous quality in the flow of time that inevitably heals all evils. There's only one certain thing about time, and that is that it waits for no one. It is not used constructively, it passes you by. In his constant concern for the progress in the fight for civil rights, King found another proverb to express that there's no easy way or quick fix, namely, no pain, no gain. One that you dealt with, Steve, in your dissertation. King cites the less frequent variant, no gain without pain, to explain that there is a heavy price to pay, an additional proverbial phrase that, by the way, is one of the favorites of President Obama, for social advancement. So here's Martin Luther King again. And I do not want to give you the impression that it is going to be easy to get civil rights. There can be no great social gain without individual pain. And before the victory for brotherhood is won, some will have to get scarred up a bit. Before the victory is won, some more will be thrown into jail, and some may have to face physical death. But if physical death is the price that we must pay to free their children and their white brothers from an eternal psychological death, then nothing can be more redemptive. Before the victory is won, some will be misunderstood and called bad names. But we must go on with a determination and with a faith that this problem can be solved. Of much use to King was also John Donne's, the British writer, famous dictum, no man is an island, that has become very popular of late, as I think we all notice. It actually comes from John Donne's poem from 1624, to reinforce his argument about America's interrelationship with the rest of the world, and therefore its need to be concerned about all citizens, not just its own. This quotation that has long turned proverb appears in numerous sermons and speeches, with the last one being included in his sermon, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, that Martin Luther King delivered right here at the National Cathedral in March 31, 1968. And he said, through our scientific and technological genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make it a brotherhood. But somehow and in some way, we have got to do this. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. That statement has actually become one of Martin Luther King's, so to speak, sententious remarks, and it winds up in Bartlett's quotations and in Fred Shapiro's Yale Book of Quotations. And he goes on and says, we are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And he goes on to say, John Donne caught it years ago and placed it in graphic terms. No man is an island entire of itself, and any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. Therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. And then he closes by saying, we must see this, believe this, and live by it if we are to remain awake through a great revolution. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, King had included a chapter entitled The World House, arguing that we have inherited a large house, a great world house in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jews, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace. And here, he says, in this uplifting passage from his sermon, he speaks of a brotherhood, sisterhood is implied. Obama, he learned so much from Martin Luther King. He often adds sisterhood to it, if you pay attention to how he speaks, realizing that the gender issue is there, you better add that, and so he should. Anyhow, and then he goes on and says that poetically, tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Okay? So as we speak today, I think maybe this is going through your minds, as we speak today of globalization and an interconnected world, it behooves us to remember such passages from Martin Luther King to appreciate what great visionary he really was, not only for civil rights in the United States, but for justice, equality, and freedom all over the globe. Now, it should not be surprising that someone who is so inclined to the use of proverbial quotations and proverbs would not also amass them, bundle them, into paragraphs of utmost rhetorical authority. Once King found a certain combination of quotations and proverbs that he liked, and I call those as set pieces, those things that are ready-made to go. He usually kept them in the same order when making use of these ready-made collages in his sermons and speeches. Whenever appropriate, he could simply call on this impressive repertoire that he basically had memorized, and he could employ them to add biblical, literary, and folkloric authority to his often quite spontaneous remarks. If you read all of his speeches, you can already, sometimes I got the feeling, okay, Martin, here it comes, and you'll see. His preference of stringing together 2 or more quotations and proverbs to express a certain belief or conviction can clearly be seen by his frequent reliance on 2 famous statements from the Declaration of Independence that I started with. By citing the proverb, all men are created equal, and the proverbial triad, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in tandem, as they appear originally in this American creed, King knows that his listeners and readers will identify positively with the fundamental ideas of equality and freedom expressed in them. But as can be imagined, Martin Luther King is not always satisfied with just citing his favorite proverb and proverbial triad. To add even more rhetorical credence to his arguments, he expands this double dose of authority by 1, 2, or even 3 additional quotations or proverbs in the same paragraph. And in order to add a somewhat satirical twist to these phrase collages, he constructs them around the idea of a responsible person. I love this. He did this several times. Of a responsible person having to be maladjusted. He loved the word maladjusted, because that's what it takes for us to get shaken up, and to do something. Employing the anaphora, a rhetorical term for repeating things, employing the anaphora as maladjusted as, and other uses of the word maladjusted, King claims that it takes maladjusted people to bring about equality, justice, and freedom. Now, in one of those speeches of September 2nd, 1957, entitled A Look into the Future, King, the stylistic tinker, as I like to call him, and mix master, blending and layering different elements of talk, augments Jefferson's proverbial words with the 3 Bible proverbs, namely, let judgment run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, one of his favorites from the book of Amos, Old Testament. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword, which we already mentioned, and of course, love your enemies. With that anaphoral tour de force, as we could call it, he has indeed found an authoritative statement for the future in which people will be courageously maladjusted to bring about social change. Well, let's listen to what Martin Luther King said. But there are some things in our social system to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and to which I suggest that you ought to be maladjusted. I call upon you to be maladjusted. Well, you see, it may be that the salvation of the world lies in the hands of the maladjusted. The challenge to you this morning, as I leave you is to be maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day could cry out in terms that echo across centuries, "Let judgment run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." As maladjusted as Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not survive half slave and half free. As maladjusted as Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery, could cry out in words lifted to cosmic proportions, "All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Yes, as maladjusted as Jesus, who dared to dream a dream of the brotherhood of man. He looked at men amid the intricate and fascinating military machinery of the Roman Empire and could say to them, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." Jesus, who could look at men in the midst of their tendencies for tragic hate and say to them, and you know what's coming, "Love thy enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you." The world is in desperate need for such maladjustment. Through such maladjustment, we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. While this rhetorical set piece that I just quoted to you, in its various mutations, can be found several times in King's sermons, speeches, and books, mention should also be made of a similar, often repeated and reformulated paragraph that also appears in his emotionally charged speech, "Our God is Marching On March 25, 1965, at Montgomery. It amasses 3 quotational proverbs and a Bible proverb without a source attribution into a set piece of messianic discourse for human rights. And some of you might have heard this one or read it. "I know you are asking today, how long will it take? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth pressed to earth will rise again." That's a quotation actually by William Cullen Bryant. "How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever." Quotation by Thomas Carlyle. "How long? Not long, because you will still reap what you sow." Bible, Galatians 6:7. "How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it tends toward justice." That is often associated with Martin Luther King, but it is not by Martin Luther King. It is actually a quotation by the famous American abolitionist, contemporary of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, Theodore Parker. And I believe that Martin Luther King did not know where that particular quotation came from. He never mentioned Theodore Parker, but he certainly used it many, many times and liked it very much. "How long, not long, cause mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored," and so on. Now, Martin Luther King's struggle for freedom and equality moved forward in many different ways. And as he spoke about the various paths taken, he frequently used proverbs and proverbial phrases that have the noun way, W-A-Y, way, in them. They are by their very nature usually future-oriented and are thus perfectly suited as metaphors to describe and reflect upon the way to progress. There is no doubt that King himself never tired, now there's a slip, never tired of going out of his way for the civil and human rights movement, giving his energy and time for the cause of justice and equality in the United States and far beyond. With all the setbacks and defeats, he never faltered, citing the proverbial phrase to have a long way to go to emphasize the progress that had been made, while at the same time stressing with the proverbial phrase to have a long way to go that much work still lies ahead. He connects those two phrases for the first time in his philosophically informed article on the New Negro of the South that appeared in June 1956 journal called The Socialist Call. And here's how he put it. Like the synthesis of Hegelian philosophy, which he, of course he had studied in graduate school, the realistic attitude seeks to reconcile the truth of the two opposites and avoid the extreme of both. So the realist in race relations would agree with the optimist in saying we have come a long way. But he would balance that by agreeing with the pessimist that we have a long, long way to go. It is this realistic position that I would like to set forth. We have come a long way, and we have a long, long way to go. And then that lecture that he gave becomes a wonderful, beautifully structured essay playing off those two. But there's one more. In addition to these proverbial expressions commenting on the long way of the civil rights movement, there's also Martin Luther King's ingenious use of the spiritual, maybe if you want to look at it from a faith point of view, and secular, just basic human social hope, a proverb, God can or will make a way out of no way. It grew out of the African-American experience of searching to carve out a life of equality and dignity. Strange as it might seem, very little is known about the actual origin, history, and dissemination of this hopeful piece of folk wisdom. I double-checked in Steve's thesis, he doesn't mention it. It does not appear in any of the standard proverb collections that are notoriously slow in registering new proverbs. But there's no doubt that it is indeed a folk proverb with considerable amounts of recorded references. Its original version, the more religious one, God can or will make a way out of no way, yields several thousand Google hits, with its truncated and secular variant just simply making a way out of no way, easily reaching into 100,000 references in Google. The proverb does not appear to have been registered in print before 1900, but again, that doesn't automatically mean that it might not have already been known prior to that date. But certainly the essence of the black experience is expressed in the proverb, making a way out of no way. And it reflects the African American worldview of trying to cope and advance with God's help in a world that is not exactly supportive of their efforts. With this background, we can turn to Martin Luther King's obvious knowledge of and multiple use of this proverb. For example, during an interview, again with that famous Playboy matter, editors that appeared in 1965, he recounted what he had said to the people involved in Montgomery, in the Montgomery bus boycott. And while his memory is quite correct, he now states the proverb with God as its clear subject. And he said, God will make a way for us when there seems no way. By expanding its text slightly, King does in fact explicate its meaning to the editors, who, I would argue, most likely as whites, might not have known the African-American proverb at the time. And here's what he told them. We had been struggling to make the boycott a success when the city of Montgomery successfully obtained an injunction from the court to stop our carpool. I didn't know what to say to our people. They had backed us up, and we had let them down. It was a desolate moment. All of us saw, that the court, Supreme Court, was leaning against us. I remember telling a group of those working closest with me to spread in the Negro community the message, we must have the faith that things will work out somehow, that God will make a way for us when there seems no way. It was about noontime, I remember, when Rex Thomas of the Associated Press rushed over to where I was sitting and told me of the news flash that the U.S. Supreme Court had declared that bus segregation in Montgomery was unconstitutional. It had literally been the darkest hour before the dawn. And that, of course, is proverbial as well. On August 16, 1967, King cites the proverb once again in his last address as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, entitling his remarks with the question, "Where do we go from here?" Almost as expected by now, the proverb is to be found in the last paragraph of the entire speech, in which King looks with much hope to a better future. While the two quotational proverbs, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it tends towards justice," from Theodore Parker, and "Truth crushed to earth will rise again," together with the Bible proverb, "As you sow, so shall you reap," imply that morality, honesty, and diligence will be rewarded. It is also made clear that there is a power that is able to make a way out of no way for the American people, African American people. And he said, "When our days become dreary, with low hovering clouds of despair, and when our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, let us remember that there is a creative force in this universe, working to pull down the gigantic mountains of evil, a power that is able to make a way out of no way and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Let us realize that William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. Let us go out realizing that the Bible is right. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. This is our hope for the future, and with this faith we will be able to sing in some not too distant tomorrow with a cosmic past tense. It's even a grammarian, as you can see, cosmic past tense. We have overcome, deep in my heart, I did believe we would overcome. And I maybe should say that I dedicated my Martin Luther King book to Congressman John Lewis, whom I experienced 3 years ago at the University of Vermont when we gave him an honorary degree. And I don't know, that speech that Congressman Lewis gave, I know I was not the only one who had tears running down our eyes, but I just love that man. And so when I worked on this book, and one night I don't know, I was sitting there saying, well, whom could I dedicate this book to? And God, the poor man doesn't know me from a hole in the ground. but I just thought that was the thing to do. And then I quoted quite a passage from his speech that he gave at the University of Vermont. Anyhow, we're almost finished, by the way. The fact that Martin Luther King quotes the proverb in these variants is a clear indication that he very much knew the proverb and so on. But what I wanted to mention about Congressman Lewis is he, in one of his writings, refers to Martin Luther King's language as being poetic. And I think you really got that feeling today, didn't you, in some of the things that I quoted. Look, I can't finish up. I think you'd be disappointed, I would think, if I don't at least mention the I Have a Dream speech, which most of you will know by heart. But since I grew up in Detroit for a couple of years when I came to America in 1960, I want to give Detroit a little bit of credit in all of this. I don't know how aware you are of the fact, but that Aretha Franklin, who I'm a great admirer of hers from my Motown years, and her father, Reverend Franklin, invited Martin Luther King to come to Cobo Hall about 3 months prior to his speech, that the famous one that he gave on August 28, 1963 here. And I have to say, in Washington even, that I think the one he gave at Cobo Hall was any time as great. But of course the international national press wasn't there to really eat it up, the way we eventually did. But in any case, I think the I Have a Dream speech that he gave in Detroit was a little bit more spontaneous and free-flowing, whereas the speech that he gave at Washington, D.C. was very much labored on. We have all his manuscripts, all how he worked on it. He had not really the I Have a Dream peroration in it. And only when he left the manuscript in the emotional part of giving his rather worked upon speech, not as natural as a sermon that he was used to giving, is when he then left it and went to his set piece of I Have a Dream, which he had developed at least a year and a half prior to the Washington speech and used in various mutations. And I think the one in Detroit is nothing to sneeze at. Anyhow, to get to that, I won't go into great detail, but I want to at least show you, by the time King delivered his I Have a Dream speech with its set of quotational and proverbial statements right here at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963. We all know this. It was billed as the keynote address at the March on Washington for Civil Rights event. The press from here and abroad was present. 250,000 people had assembled, and Martin Luther King found himself at the largest public event of the civil rights movement. It gave him and his idea of nonviolent struggle for equality, justice, and freedom a national and international forum. That's, of course, what happened. But here then is the considerably shortened I Have a Dream peroration with its 3 proverbial statements. And that, from my proverbial rhetoric point of view, in Detroit, there were a few others, which I think made his speech even more powerful. But here are the ones he used in just the little part I'm going to read to you. All men are created equal, and the proverbial phrases, and this is the one that is very much associated with Martin Luther King as one of his own, and that is to be judged by the content of one's character and not by the color of one's skin. Okay, that you will find in books of quotations and so on. And very importantly, a very, very simple proverbial phrase, to join hands with someone. And here's, again, this is something that we all know, but I just want to refresh your memory. So I say to you, my friends, that even though we must face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. So let freedom ring. And when we allow freedom to ring, when it will ring from every village and hamlet, from every state and city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, will be able to join hands and to sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. By the end of 1967, the I Have a Dream anaphora, modified to I Still Have a Dream, after its international exposure at the Lincoln Memorial here in Washington, had doubtlessly become King's rhetorical signature phrase. And again, if you look in books of quotations, I have a dream. You know, it's a very normal sentence if you think about it, but it is, of course, now associated with Martin Luther King. Of course, it represents but one of his quotational and proverbial leitmotifs that made his sermons, speeches, letters, essays, and books to such effective and memorable statements in the cause of civil and human rights. Quotations turned proverbs, Bible proverbs, folk proverbs, and a plethora of proverbial expressions are an intrinsic part of King's rhetorical prowess, providing his messages with colorful metaphors and authoritative strength. His noble dream of an America and a world interconnected by equality, justice, freedom, love, and hope had to be expressed through language, so that the nonviolent movement for civil and human rights could march forward. Individual words and sentences were needed to bring these dignified ideals across, and there can be no doubt that proverbs and proverbial phrases as ready-made expressions served King extremely well in adding imagery and expressiveness to his numerous oral and written communications. His dream needed words and deeds, and being a master of both, Martin Luther King was and remains the visionary champion of making a way out of no way for all of humanity that due to him has come a long way, but still has a long way to go. Moving on with an adherence to the biblical triad of faith, hope, and love, and the acceptance of the African American proverb, making a way out of no way, will keep Martin Luther King's proverbial dream alive for future generations as they confront their fate in the world house of brotherly and sisterly mutuality. Thank you very much.
And if anyone would like to ask questions, now's the time.
Before I take your question, I wanted to quickly recognize this young lady up here yet. This is Kate sitting up here. And when she walked in, she said to me, "Oh, Professor Mieder, greetings from my parents, Mary Jo and Redding. I happen to be their daughter." So there again, the life of a professor, you no matter where you go, you all of a sudden meet the children of your former students. And Kate, that's wonderful that you came, so thank you. Yes, sir.
Do you have passages from the letter from the Birmingham jail?
Yes, in the book I cite it several times, right? Yes, yeah. But I didn't, in this short version of what I chose, I did not quote from the letter. Yes, but there are quite a number of proverbial statements in that very, very famous letter as well, right?
Can you give us some of them?
Not right out of my little brain. No, I'd have to look, right? But it's bound to be some of the ones that that I probably the ones I mentioned today would be his high frequency usage ones. That's what I wanted to show you. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I did a study of Proverbs in the Blues, and the most
I know you did,
there
yeah.
was you reap what you sow, and you cite 2 instances. Did he use that a lot? I'm wondering, because it seems somewhat problematic in terms of his philosophy.
Yeah, I have in the book, and I don't at all mean to make propaganda for my book here, but in the book, I have a statistical table, Michael, on remember I said kind of as an aside that he used love your enemies 53 times. I believe he used that proverb about 4 or 5 times. That's not a high frequency at all, but I can look it up and give you the exact number. Yeah. Well, Michael, I don't mind that question at all. Proverbs are an interesting phenomenon. They don't always fit, but they often fit. And I oftentimes, when I talk with my students, I say to them, you all know the proverb, if the shoe fits, wear it. And I think you could alter that to say, if the proverb fits, use it. If it doesn't fit, now it comes, if it doesn't fit, use another one. So I'll just give you one flippant example. We all use out of sight, out of mind. But of course, you also can immediately say absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? So Proverbs are as contradictory as life itself. They are not a philosophical, logical system, but rather wisdom. And sometimes it's wise to act this way, and sometimes it's wise to act that way, depending on the context. So, Michael, the way Martin Luther King will incorporate folk wisdom or Bible wisdom is exactly in the way, if it fits his argument, and sometimes his argument might be a negative one, in which case the negative proverb fits perfectly well. But and I know Michael's wonderful work on Proverbs in the Blues. If I remember right, I published one of your articles, didn't I, Mike? Songs. The origin, to get back to even Steve's interest, of modern proverbs as well. It is amazing how many proverbs of the modern age that we know have originated from songs. And we could mention President Obama one more time. We know that from him. that he likes Motown music, and he quite often brings in sentences from various of the song tradition, and I've kind of enjoyed that. If you, I'm sure many of you have read his book, his biography, Dreams from My Father, and if you remember, the centerpiece is when he is an organizer in the south end of Chicago, and there is that famous scene where his friend, after a young girl has jumped down from the balcony and killed herself, he makes a statement, "The world is a place." And that actually comes from a song group called Rhythm. You probably know that, Steve. Steve is our expert on music. The song Rhythm, and I mean, the group Rhythm, 1976, and in there it is, the world is a place for the whole human race to live and act together. So sometimes when I worked on President Obama, I can kind of tell where he gets some of his modern proverbs from. This proverb that I mentioned earlier about no gain, no pain, no gain, which I think all of you have, heard for various reasons through your health clubs, exercising, and kind of a rationalization for pain of doing exercise. It is nothing new at all. It goes back to the 16th century. But this happens with Proverbs too. For a while, Proverbs can drop to a certain degree out of circulation because you're not especially relating to it. But no pain, no gain in the modern commercialized exercising industry has all of a sudden become very popular again.
Well, Soloflex used it as their ad in the
That's
80s,
right.
and that's when it...
That's when it really took
yeah.
off, Steve. That's right. Yes, sir.
The speech that Dr. King gave before he was assassinated, when he said, "I've been to the mountain
Yeah.
top and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you."
Right.
You know where that comes from?
No, I better not speculate on it. But I think with some of those metaphors, he oftentimes, I think the promised land you will find in the Bible. I mean, I think he, so.
Okay, well, may I ask you this? In terms of his formal training,
Yeah.
when he went to theological
Oh, yeah,
seminary,
yeah.
are preachers taught how to write sermons?
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely.
Go through a training?
Oh yes, you can, and Martin Luther King was of course lucky. He had a father. I mean, he came out of a real Baptist, African American Baptist preacher tradition. So that fancy rhetorical term that I used, anaphora, this using a certain phrasal part and repeating it. How long and so on. Listen to Barack Obama. He has very, very much picked up, and he learned it from Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King and maybe his own church going. So Martin Luther King as a preacher, and we have in the definitive edition of Martin Luther King's work that is being published out at Stanford University, we really know that he was a very conscious stylist. He already in graduate school, all of his papers that he wrote in graduate school, you can see how consciously he works on certain rhythmic patterns. The other thing, I did not read this here, but the audience response in the sermons is very, very impressive, where someone really transcribed the sermons. Amen and yes man and all this. That adds an incredible emotional power to it. But yes, he was well trained, but he also simply knew a lot about rhetoric and preaching style simply by having experienced it from folk preachers who did it with natural talent, including his father. But it went very quickly that people would praise Martin Luther King and would say to his father, "Look at what your son can do. What's wrong with you?" So we can go back. We can get back to Steve's metaphor at the beginning. Standing on shoulders of giants. So, but no, I think and it is. Maybe one could say this yet. Notice the difference. let's just say Barack Obama and King. If Barack Obama, already right from the beginning when he started to run for president, if he gave a speech, let's just say, in Montgomery, and flew off to San Francisco and gave a speech a few hours later there, with modern media, with modern technology, it would be, I don't want to say dangerous, but I mean, the American people would soon say, Obama always says the same stuff, right? So, because our communications go so fast. I think for Martin Luther King, he could still, let's say, give a speech in Montgomery and give quite a similar speech 100 miles away, you know. But I noticed with Barack Obama, he too faced that problem, because when he was on the so-called stomp, I mean, you can't expect from a normal mortal to prepare, leave alone a professor type. You know, we can't do this at all. But I mean, to have a presidential candidate give a brand new speech every day of the week, you know. So that is what I'm getting at, is when you read the works of our greats, even a hero like Abraham Lincoln, there will be repetition. There will be drawing on traditions. And I mean, why do we quote literary quotations, famous people quotations, or anonymous folk proverbs? Why do we do that? Because there's authority behind them. There's wisdom, you know, and you associate yourself with that. Yes?
Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
Like me today. I enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
Are there parts, or you have a passage from the Cobo Hall speech that King gave that you could compare and contrast with this Washington speech?
Well, I already kind of alluded to it. He has about 3 or 4 more. For example, the joining of the hands pops up twice in the peroration. He starts the peroration with joining hands, as I remember right now, and then he winds up with it. And if you just wait a second, I can show it to you in a moment. But I think he has in the peroration of the Detroit speech, he also has the one of the arc of the one from Theodore Parker is in it as well. Just let me have this fun in Washington. If the speech that he gave at Cobo Hall, and I want to stress one more time, he had already given I Have a Dream endings of speeches several times prior to Cobo Hall. He started that in around 1961. But if Cobo Hall's speech had for whatever reason received the international and national attention, I would have thought it would have been wonderful for Detroit. My heart bleeds for Detroit. You know, I spent 2 of my happiest years in Detroit. I had the good fortune of having the most wonderful American family who taught me some of the little bit of wisdom I learned there. And Detroit was doing relatively well in 1960, you know. But to see Detroit now, you know, Michigan as a state, I should say this, I also went to the University of Michigan, I went to Michigan State, so I'm a real Michigan person, you know, and I feel bad for that state, you know, with the incredible unemployment, the moving of much of the industry, you know, moving out of the state. And I just heard recently that Pittsburgh, on the national news, that Pittsburgh has really been able to overcome, let's just say, the steel industry break up and so on. And Pittsburgh is on a real renaissance, so to speak. And remember when they built the Renaissance Center in Detroit, we even had an American Folklore Society meeting at that. But yes, I think it would have been nice for Detroit to have that recognition. But it's okay for Washington to have it too. You know, just having some fun with this. But no, I think Martin Luther King is without any doubt one of the greatest human beings of the 20th century. There's no doubt about it. In deed and word. Thank you very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.